Sheldon Solomon is Ross Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies at Skidmore College. As an experimental social psychologist, his interests include the nature of self-consciousness and social behavior. His work, exploring the effects of the uniquely human awareness of death on individual and social behavior, has been supported by the National Science Foundation and was featured in an award-winning films, Flight from Death, The Quest for Immortality, and The Anatomy of Hate. He is co-author of In the Wake of 9/11, The Psychology of Terror, and he is co-founder of the World Leaders Project. So let's welcome Sheldon.
Thank you, Ed, and good morning, everybody. Sound okay, folks back in coach? All right. This is great to be here again. I think I was here almost a year ago to this day, and it was a delightful surprise to be invited back. And I'm particularly pleased to speak today about gratitude and humility. And in that vein, I'm first of all grateful to Dr. Neil Alge for everything that he's done for the foundation and for being just a particularly foolish gentleman in the best sense of the word, because as Neil mentioned, I was the first public speaker for the Becker Foundation, I think in 1994, and truth be told, that's the only time I ever knew what I was talking about. And ever since then, in academics, it's traditionally the case that you need to know what you're talking about before you get to talk about things. But due to Neil's patience and generosity, I've had the honor, I think, more than a dozen times of being able to say to Neil, you know what, Neil, I have a half-baked idea. Can I come out and talk about it, and in so doing, maybe figure out what it is that I'm actually thinking about. So today is no exception. I spent this morning in my Seattle office, that's Kinko's in the U District, and I made my little handout. I have a talk that I hope will be of interest, and if it works out, then it'll be a real talk someday, and maybe I'll get to come back and be a little bit more polished. Also want to thank my mom and dad. They're not here, but if they were, they would be very tickled. They used to say to me when I was, in my 20s and I first became a professor, they'll be like, you'll never get away with it. You need to buy some pants, and people will just realize that you don't know what you're talking about, and you will be seen for the imposter that you are. And it would just be great, because if they were here, I would just be like, look, it's working out pretty well so far. The other thing, I am grateful to my parents, because in retrospect, and I think I've joked about this in a variety of venues here in Seattle, but a lot of psychology is common sense masquerading as wisdom, and a lot of psychology is also just a belated recognition of ideas that have been floating around in the spiritual mist for thousands of years. And there were two things my parents always said to me when I was little, that, of course, when you're young, you don't necessarily appreciate. One was that the world doesn't owe you a living, and that therefore we need to be grateful for what it is that we have. And this is particularly true for many of us in America, where our biggest problem is, what color shirt am I going to wear today? Not, is there going to be lunch, or will I have a home by the end of the day? And the other thing they always stressed was the need for humility. The way they put it is, there's always somebody bigger and better than you. And while they were always proud of anything that I accomplished, particularly things that were earned by virtue of diligent effort, they realized that one needs to keep our accomplishments in perspective. And so, in that spirit, I want to talk about some research that I just noticed because it just happened in the last few years. And in a bit, I'm going to talk about, and I want to give you a little book report of a great book that was also just published this year. It's on your little handout. It's called The Slavery of Death by Richard Becker. And to anticipate what I want to say, so if I falter, you'll know what the point is by the time I finish. I want to argue today that theology and contemporary experimental psychology converge rather wonderfully on the notion that, psychologically speaking, gratitude and humility are of tremendous importance. It's not only psychologically uplifting from a personal point of view, but it also brings the best out in us as individuals. And so, with that in mind, let's do a 5 or so minute classic comic book overview of Ernest Becker's ideas, just so we can be on the same page. You all look vaguely familiar to me, but who have I seen before, just so I know? Yeah, that's good. I know everyone, like I say, you all look very familiar. And who's not acquainted with Ernest Becker's ideas? And this is also fine. Welcome. You'll be up to speed in the next 3 to 5 minutes. Ernest Becker was a cultural anthropologist who was at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver when he expired tragically and prematurely at the age of 49 in 1973. 6 weeks before he won a Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction for his book, The Denial of Death. Throughout Becker's illustrious and very productive career, he was fundamentally preoccupied with delineating the motivational underpinnings of human behavior. And he asked a disarmingly simple question in a book called The Birth and Death of Meaning, which is what attracted me to his work when he said, why do people do what they do when they do it, or something along those lines. He was interested in just understanding why people behave the way that we do. And what he said very simply is that if we want to get a handle on human behavior, we need to, on the one hand, think about how it is that people are similar to all other things that are alive, and at the same time ponder how it is that we're uniquely different. And following Darwin, he just said, well, you know what? We share with all forms of life a basic predisposition towards survival, not only in the service of self-preservation, but also reproduction. So in that way, we're no different than birds or bugs. On the other hand, we're tremendously different with regard to the uniquely human capacity to engage in abstract and symbolic thought, to the point where we are unique, as far as we can tell, in the sublime ability to imagine things that don't even exist, and then to render our dreams tangible in the form of concrete manifestations. And I hope that that's obvious, that that's pretty handy for staying alive. But the point that Becker makes, leaning on the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, is that we're actually so smart that we come to recognize that we exist. And I hope you can all grant that you're vaguely or not so vaguely aware that you're here right now. And the point that Kierkegaard makes is that we take self-awareness for granted when, in fact, it takes a ridiculously sophisticated cognitive apparatus to render yourself, in Kierkegaard's words, the object of your own subjective inquiry. And what Kierkegaard said is, look, if you know that you're here, that is both awesome and dreadful. It's awesome to be alive and to know it. And I hope everybody on such a beautiful day is just explicitly pleased with the prospect of not only being alive, but knowing that you're here. On the other hand, Becker points out that if you're smart enough to know that you exist, you're also shackled with the coincident existential baggage that comes from the realization that, like all living things, you are of finite duration. And that's just my diplomatic way of saying you too will someday die. Not only that, but you can die at any time for reasons that you could never anticipate or control. And moreover, we're put off by the prospect that from a purely biological point of view, human beings we're essentially breathing pieces of defecating meat that are no more significant or enduring than cucumbers or cockroaches. And what Becker proposes is that all of those realizations together would render humanity literally paralyzed with overwhelming existential terror in the absence of an adaptation that affords us a modicum of psychological equanimity. And what he proposes is that our ancestors accomplished that quite ingeniously through the formation and maintenance of what the anthropologists call culture, humanly constructed beliefs about the nature of reality that give us each a sense that we live in a world that has meaning, and that we as individuals perceive ourselves as significant participants in the cosmological drama to which we subscribe. And so from Ernest Becker's point of view, in order to stand up every day, we need to perceive ourselves as persons of value in a world of meaning. And when we feel that way, that's what he calls self-esteem. And his argument, and here he's following William James, who said something along the lines that the earth is a theater for heroism, that all of us, whether we're aware of it or not, are fundamentally motivated to preserve faith in our culturally constructed views of the world, as well as a sense that we meet or exceed the standards of value associated with the social roles that we inhabit in that world. And what's really at stake is heroic transcendence over death in the form of either literal or symbolic immortality. I think that's pretty much what Becker said, and if we had more time we could elaborate a bit, but that's, I think, in a nutshell, a pretty good articulation of Becker's basic ideas. And we know there's a whole lot of evidence that suggests that indeed when we confidently adhere to our cultural worldviews, when we feel like we have self-esteem, that really does buffer existential anxiety very nicely. On the other hand, though, Becker was very much aware, and he writes about this in all of his books, that our cultural worldviews, as well as our self-esteem, are essentially fragile, symbolic cultural constructions. And therefore, it takes a lot of time and energy to defend them, particularly when concerns about our mortality are aroused. And so, for example, we have done dozens of studies in a little paradigm we call the mortality salience paradigm, where we basically just make people ponder their own mortality. Right, so sometimes we bring people into the lab and we just ask them to write a little bit about what their thoughts and feelings about their own death arouse in them. Sometimes we stop folks on the street in front of a funeral parlor as opposed to a grocery store. Sometimes, and this is even more insidious, we park people in front of a computer screen and we ask them to read things, but unbeknownst to them, we flash the word death so fast, 28 milliseconds, that you can't see that you've been exposed to any of that. Right? And what we find is that when people are reminded of their mortality, they become particularly hostile to other individuals who don't share their beliefs about the nature of reality. So in one early study, when Christian Americans were reminded of their mortality, they became more favorably disposed to fellow Christians, but they really despised Jewish people. And this same finding obtains for lots of different flavors of people. So in Israel, Jewish people reminded of their mortality become more partial to fellow Jewish people, and then they hate Christians and Arabs and so on and so forth. Not only that, but when you're reminded of your mortality, it increases the distance that you put between yourself and someone who looks different. You literally sit further away from people who look different. Moreover, if you're given an opportunity to physically harm somebody who does not share your beliefs about the nature of reality, when you are reminded of your own death, you will do that. And the point that Ernest Becker makes, and he says that this is not just true of the Hitlers and the Saddam Husseins of the world, that this is true for you and I. In the book Escape from Evil, what Becker points out ironically, and that this is one of the great tragedies of human history, is that most of the evil in the world is caused by regular people like you and I responding to existential threats by trying to rid the world of evil in the form of denigrating and destroying other folks who we declare to be different. And I know you're all familiar with, is it Hannah Arendt, the banality of evil? And the point is that that's a bad thing. And I think anyone who reads the newspapers these days will agree that the world's a tenuous place and that that's really not something that we should be proud of. Right? But if there's the banality of evil, we can also turn that around and just talk about the evil of banality, because on the one hand, when we're reminded of our mortality, we despise and destroy people who are different. When we're reminded about our mortality, we also do whatever it is that will bolster our own self-esteem. And this can have extraordinarily unfortunate consequences, not only for us as individuals, but also for the world around us. And so, for example, we know that people who pride themselves on their driving skill, does anybody know like a Mario Andretti in Waiting? When they're reminded of death, they drive more recklessly. People whose self-esteem is based on their physical appearance, when they're reminded of death, they say they want to go hit the tanning booth. People who smoke cigarettes and see that as part of their self-image, when they're reminded of death, they smoke more cigarettes. People who believe that their self can be measured in terms of material assets, when they're reminded of death, they get more greedy. People who are materialistic, when they're reminded of death, they become more desirous of things like a Lexus and a Rolex, but not a toaster or a Chevy. And the point that Ernest Becker makes, and I think this is an important one, is that human beings who are solely devoted to earthly heroism, that's going to be extraordinarily problematic if there's not concurrent devotion to what Becker described in various points in his work as some kind of invisible, transcendental power, which, for lack of a better term, he writes about in terms of God and religion. And this brings us to where we're at today, and that's this very fine book, Richard Beck, The Slavery of Death. 2014, Beck is both a PhD in experimental psychology and also a practicing Christian. And I think that this is a wonderful little book. But let's refer to our handout for a second and just see what Beck has to say to get us out of the conceptual gate today. I like this paragraph at the top of the handout because I see this is Beck, in my opinion, really summarizing Becker's ideas very pithily when he says, "Love is possible only when we've been set free from our slavery to the fear of death. Love necessarily involves mastering anxieties that are natural to biological creatures such as ourselves, because while these anxieties signal the goodness and preciousness of life, when left unchecked, they produce a variety of sinful outcomes. If expressed directly, these survival anxieties can reduce human existence to a Hobbesian and Darwinian struggle and perpetual state of anxiety, vigilance, suspicion, paranoia, rivalry, envy, competition, and aggression towards others. On the other hand, if sublimated, these anxieties produce," another misprint, you can get rid of one of those, "these anxieties produce a neurotic depth of avoidance that drives the quest for significance, meaning, and self-esteem. This quest, fueled by an underlying anxiety, produces similar forms of rivalry, competition, and aggression as we compete with others for attention, respect, and significance. Our neurotic fear of failure creates an inauthentic and appearance-obsessed social world, and our pursuit of self-esteem and significance typically leads us to serve and seek the adulation of the institutions around us. In sum, our anxiety in the face of death creates either suspicion or superficiality, depending upon whether our anxiety is basic or neurotic, whether we are focused on survival or self-esteem. Either way, love becomes compromised in the face of these fears. To be set free from these dynamics, we need to create a new sort of identity, one received as a gift rather than owned as a possession. And so what happens at this point in the book is that Beck asks us to consider what all of the great religious traditions have in common. And I like the phrase give thanks and praise, and I think it's one that we're all familiar with if we grew up in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And when I talk about giving thanks, I want to use that as a proxy for gratitude. And when we talk about praise, I want to frame that in terms of humility. And the point that Beck makes is that you can't be truly grateful without being simultaneously humble for the following reasons. And I think this is hopefully fairly obvious, but the obvious is good too if it just reminds us what's at stake here. He points out, first of all, that many of us have a tendency, myself included, to view our possessions as our own material resources that we have earned solely by virtue of our effort. And if we see things that way, then we're always going to be anxious and defensive at the prospect that our stuff can be taken away from us. On the other hand, if we see resources as gifts that are not our own, then the only appropriate stance towards them is to be grateful for them. And as obvious as this sounds, the things that really matter, stuff like air, water, the planet upon which we currently reside, the very fact that each of us is alive, we didn't do any of that, and we should be grateful for it before they privatize air, water, and earth, and that will be forthcoming. And then what Beck goes on to say, though, is, yeah, okay, but if you're truly grateful, then you also have to be humble. And here I've been reading with Dan's assistants, Reinhold Niebuhr, and I like Niebuhr's point. You know Niebuhr, I know some of you, but Niebuhr in all of his books, he just says, you know what? All of us at times run the risk of being arrogant sons of bitches, if you'll pardon the expression, because we are all prone to take too much credit for our successes and insufficient responsibility for our feelings. Those of you that might not know Niebuhr but know social psychology, that's what's called the fundamental attribution error. And this is particularly true in our society, because no society on earth, as far as I can tell, adheres to the view first advanced by John Locke, that there's no such thing in a state of nature as any society. Locke just said there's only isolated and independent individuals, and he uses that argument to justify not only the existence of private property, but moreover, and this is more important, the argument that we are entitled to everything that we acquire by virtue of our effort. And what I would humbly submit is that that's really a recipe for a sociopath rather than a compelling moral or religious philosophy. All right, so with that in mind, let's look at, back to our green piece of paper, and let's look at C.K. Chesterton. Dan, what was he? Was he a theologian?
Yeah, he was a writer.
Yeah.
And a theologian. And I think he was ordained in later in life.
That's what I thought also. So I ran across this little blurb, and this will help frame the rest of the presentation today. But I like Chesterton really pulling things together, for me at least. The truth is that all genuine appreciation, I'm going to, if I had another chance at my handout, I'd put gratitude there, because I think that's genuine appreciation, rests on a certain mystery of humility and almost darkness. The man who said, "Blessed is he that expecteth nothing, for he shall not be disappointed," put the eulogy quite inadequately and even falsely. The truth is, blessed is he that expecteth nothing, for he shall be gloriously surprised. The man who expects nothing, and woman too, sees redder roses than common men can see, and greener grass, and a more startling sun. Blessed is he that expecteth nothing, for he shall possess the cities and the mountains. Blessed is the meek, for he shall inherit the earth. Until we realize that things might not be, we cannot realize that things are. Until we see that darkness, we cannot admire the light as a single and created thing. As soon as we have seen that darkness, all light is lightning, sudden, blinding, and divine. It is one of the million wild jests of truth that we know nothing until we know nothing. That's awesome. That's why great people are great. And I'm like sit here trying to choke out a monosyllabic utterance. Anyway, if we turn the page though, my point is I think there's a whole biblical tradition, not only in the Judeo-Christian Islamic world, but in Eastern religions as well, that values gratitude and humility, as far as I can tell, and at the risk of blaspheming. I don't know any religion that just proclaims we're the best and fuck the rest, although there are practitioners of all religions, as Dan was pointing out at dinner last night, that subscribe to that view. And now what I want to point out, I just think this is the loveliest confluence of theological insight corroborated by contemporary science, that there's a recent series of experiments that I believe provides just profound support for the contention that gratitude and humility serve to buffer existential anxiety, just as our cultural worldviews and self-esteem do, but we don't get the defensive downside because there's nothing to defend, and therefore you get all of the up without any of the down. This first series of studies that I want to give you a little summary of, A Quiet Ego Quiets Death Anxiety, this was done by my buddy Tom's graduate student, a woman named Palin Kesbar, and it just came out a month or two ago, so this is hot off the proverbial presses, as it were. Thing one, this is a beautifully written article, and if you want to see it, write to me, and you can look it up, of course. I have a citation, but if you'd like a copy, email me and I'll send you the actual article. The first thing that I like about it is just Palin's description of what a humble person would be like. It's one thing to use the word humble, and it's another thing to put a little bit of concrete flesh on what might otherwise seem to be an amorphous and therefore difficult term to embrace. And here's what she says: a humble person is first and foremost capable of tolerating an honest look at the self and non-defensively accepting weaknesses alongside strengths. This does not represent a sense of inferiority or self-denigration, but rather lack of self-aggrandizing biases. The propensity for seeing the self in true perspective is typically accompanied by an awareness of the self's smallness in the grand scheme of things. Humble people tend to be more sensitive and feel more connected to forces larger than themselves, be this force God, humanity, nature, or the cosmos. Finally, and relatedly, those who stand in humility exhibit a remarkable lack of self-focus and a talent for self-forgetfulness, for becoming unselved. They are easily able to take themselves out of the middle of the picture and direct attention toward the greater world beyond. In seeing, honoring, and potentially contributing to something bigger than themselves, they transcend egotistical concerns and the attendant urge for defensive, self-serving maneuvers. And I like that. I think that's good. Those of you that are familiar with Ernest Becker's denial of death, I would just call your attention to how comparable or compatible is Palin's description of a humble person with Becker's suggestion of what one might be like if we ever enrolled and graduated from Kierkegaard's School of Anxiety. Because in the denial of death, Becker says, well, if you're ever a successful candidate for a degree in the School of Anxiety, we will know that because you will be distinguished by your humility and your openness to a multidimensional reality. All right, so got to do a little bit of egghead experimental work. So we're going to talk about 5 studies that Palin did. And I'm not going to, talking about experiments is often a very effective non-pharmacological intervention for insomnia, but I'm going to try and, I'll try and keep it simple here because I think that these are, and the idea here, by the way, is that no one of these studies in and of itself is necessarily conclusive, but when we step back after I talk about all of them, I hope you'll agree that humility is really a very potent tool in humanity's psychological kit, as it were. All right, study number 1, moral disengagement in response to mortality salience as a function of humility. All right, what is it? What does that mean? Okay, so, all right, moral disengagement is just a piece of psychological jargon for when we become, for a variety of reasons, less committed to our moral values. And so, for example, let me give you sorry, Corey. All right, so, and there's a scale that measures moral disengagement. So here's some items. Considering the ways people grossly misrepresent themselves, it's hardly a sin to inflate your own credentials. Here's another one. People shouldn't be held accountable for doing questionable things when they were just doing what an authority figure told them to do. All right, so what we know about moral disengagement is that under normal conditions, when you remind people of their mortality, they become more morally disengaged. Head shakes if what I said just made sense. Head shakes for an emotional boost. I'll say it one more time. When people are reminded of their own death, they become, to be blunt, relatively immoral. They become more favorably predisposed to considering ways people grossly misrepresent themselves. It's hardly a sin to inflate themselves. And they deny responsibility for questionable deeds under the guise of somebody told me. All right, well, the first study, what Palin did, is she measured humility as an individual difference. And so all that means is you get a pile of people and you ask them to just rate themselves on a number of adjectives that have to do with being humble. And then she basically divided her pile of people. It's more complex than this, and anyone who's statistically inclined, we can talk more. But as a grotesque oversimplification, she divided her sample into humble people and not humble people. She reminded them of their mortality, and then she measured moral disengagement. How's that sound? All right, now, so what she found was for the people who did not rate themselves as humble, thinking about themselves dying, they did the same thing. They increased moral disengagement. All right, but the people who described themselves as humble, they responded the other way. When they were reminded of their mortality, they became more morally engaged. And that's a very interesting, albeit not completely convincing finding, but that was her first study, is that depending upon whether you're humble or not, reminders of death have a diametrically opposite effect on your own self-ratings of moral engagement. All right, study number 2. She said, okay, that's interesting. Now what we're going to do is we're going to measure humility again. We're going to have humble people and we're going to have not humble people. And we're going to remind them of their mortality. And then we're going to measure fear of death. So now we want to see what happens, because if this is driven by concerns about mortality, and if people with humility respond to their mortality, psychologically speaking, differently than people who are not, then she argues we should be able to detect that in fear of death as a consequence of being reminded of the fact that you someday die. And what she found, very simply in accord with her claim, is that people who are not humble, when they were reminded of death, they reported that they were more afraid of death. Humble people reported that they were less afraid of death. So here's another indication of humility literally being a psychological fork in the road where you respond to existential threats in a radically different way. All right, study number 3, she turns around and she says, okay, I'm going to keep going here, but now instead of studying humility, she says, I'm going to study entitlement. And she just says, well, I think that's the opposite of humility, that people that feel that they're entitled, well, they're not humble people. And so here's some items from an entitlement scale. I honestly feel I'm just more deserving than others. I feel entitled to more of everything. The average American, basically. All right, and so what she did was she had people fill out that scale. Same thing. People that reported being very entitled. People that said, no, I'm not entitled to everything. She reminded them of their mortality. And these were all Americans who reported being either Jewish, Christian, or agnostic. And then she just had them evaluate Islam. And who's aware that Islam's one of the strongest prejudices in America still? And since 9/11, it's been one of the prejudices du jour. All right, well, what she found is that entitled people, reminded of their mortality, became virulently hostile and derogatory to Islam. But this did not happen for the folks who did not claim to be entitled. In fact, they became slightly more supportive of Islam as a result. All right, so she's like, wow. So here we have 3 different experiments converging on the view that when you perceive yourself either as humble or unentitled, that produces radically different effects to existential threats. All right, that's what she did in her final 2 studies, was to turn this idea around and to say, okay, and there's methodological reasons why you would want to do this, but she says rather than ask people if they're humble or not, because for those chemistry fans, there's Avogadro's number of alternative explanations for why that would produce those outcomes. Now she turns around and she says, okay, what I'm going to do now is to ask people to remember a time when they behaved in a humble fashion. All right, so we're going to call that humility salience. So she brings people into the lab and she just asks them to write a bit about a time when they were humble. And then she measures fear of death. And what she finds here is that after being asked to consider yourself as a humble individual, fear of death goes down. That's a very potent finding, more important than the first study that I described. Like last study, and I know you've been working hard, so I appreciate this. I have 2 more studies, but last one for Palin is when she does the same thing. She does this humility salience induction. Think about a time that you were humble. Right, then she has people think about death. And then she measures self-control. All right, so there's a scale. See, psychologists have a scale for everything. And then this one is called the, what is it called? Oh, it's called the temptation scale. So I like this one. All right, so these things, so she asked people, how often do you put off work that needs to get done, procrastinate, drink beer, do nothing, eat fried food, spend rather than save your money, get drunk. It's a scale, it's a valid and reliable scale that measures whether or not we can control ourselves. All right, what we know is that in general, when people are reminded of their mortality, they're more prone to succumb to temptation. And there's a variety of reasons why that's the case, but that did not happen if before being reminded of your mortality, you were asked to think about a time when you behaved in a humble fashion. So who remembers the biblical exhortation, lead us not into temptation? All right, well, to not be led into temptation, according to this, it would be a good idea to humble thyself. All right, let's talk a little bit about gratitude very quickly. Back to our little handout, death and gratitude. gratitude. Death reflection enhances gratitude. Some of you have heard me say before that I love Albert Camus, and I love a little phrase that he evidently hand wrote in the margin of his notebooks where he says, "Come to terms with death. Thereafter, anything is possible." And I don't know these folks, but they're a research team at the University of someplace. They're at they're here, Eastern Washington University. And so here's what they say. One important component of the grateful person may be that they understand that the benefits they enjoy now might not be. Perhaps when individuals become aware that life is a benefit that is not given, they then gain an appreciation and gratitude for the life that they have. By reflecting on one's own mortality, this could enhance one's awareness that their life might not be, and hence might become more grateful for the life that they have. Do people become more grateful when they are reflecting on their own death? The purpose of this study was to investigate that question. This is a very simple study, so I'll do it very, very quickly. Same paradigm. You ask some people to think about themselves dying. You ask other people to think about something unpleasant but not fatal. And then they just administered what they called a gratitude scale. Gratitude for life. How grateful are you for your life? How thankful are you for being alive? Right now, how much do you feel that your life is a gift? How appreciative do you feel for your life right now? All right, now, common sense might dictate that when you're reminded of your own death, that you might become less grateful. Does that make sense? All right, but that's not what happened. In fact, quite the opposite. In this particular sample, which we're now trying to replicate at Skidmore, what they found is that reminders of mortality actually increased gratitude. All right, so the take-home message here is gratitude good. Humility, good. We know that from our Sunday school days, but now we know it from egghead, hardcore science too. And to just get us done, if I can find my piece of paper, I can't, so I'm going to have to make this up. Maybe I can find it. Okay. So, and I hope you'll read or go find The Slavery of Death, Beck's book. At the end of the book, he talks about, well, you know, how do we cultivate this kind of identity? How do we become grateful and humble people? And what Beck argues, and I think he might be right, is that this is better done in a social setting. Not that our own personal private moments have nothing to do with this, but the end of the book, he talks about the value of song, prayer, and community. And we're not going to have time, and this is good because I don't remember what he said, but what he says is, you know, there's something really uplifting about people singing together. I'm going to have to come back another time and give you a book report of Stephen Mithen, an archaeologist, a book called The Singing Neanderthals. Who's aware of the fact that we were singing long before we were talking, and we were dancing and drumming long before we had discursive conversations about the metaphysical underpinnings of life, and that singing and talking activate different parts of our brains, and song is contagious. You know, it's just, have you ever been in a setting where you just can't help it? Everyone in the room is singing, and then the next thing you know, you're tapping your toes. The song, there's just something uplifting about singing together. And then what Beck points out is that there's also something important about prayer. And so if song is uplifting, prayer is a humbling reminder that there is always someone and something bigger and better than ourselves. I'm a big fan of a guy named Walter Becker, who Neil visited in Switzerland, who wrote a book, about religion. I can't remember the title, Neil. It was like the Tracks of the Sacred. Anyway, the point that Burkert makes is that when we bow in prayer, either literally or metaphorically, we're just doing something that prevails in the animal kingdom anytime that you adopt essentially a submissive posture towards anyone or anything, and that in the act of prayer, whether we're aware of it or not, we are implicitly or explicitly submitting to a higher power. And I like that. I think that's an interesting thought. We need not all agree, but I think that's something to think about. And then finally, what Beck reminds us is the importance of community, which I hope I don't have to convince you of because you're all here today. The original derivation of the term religion, according to Becker, is that it comes from an old word in a language I can't remember, and it means to bind. Religion originally, some argue, even before we had any notion of gods or theology, that religion was the first social glue. It is what it is that unites us as fellow human beings in the world, not by ourselves, but with each other. And for that reason, religion remains important to this day in some way, shape, or form. I think that I could say some more things, but rather than do that, let me just stop and say, all right, Ed's going to come up, but say two things. To be silly but not, I am very grateful to have the opportunity to gather my thoughts in public. It is not something that all folks get to do. And I hope that despite being a little rough, that these ideas made some sense and that they'll give you something to think about. I didn't put my email on the back of this, and I'm sorry to do that, but if you write to me, I'm Sheldon Solomon, Skidmore College, ssolomon@skidmore.edu. If you have questions, comments, want to see some things, just blast me a message. All right, two thoughts, and then I'll defer to Ed. From some smart people. St. Augustine, do you wish to be great? Then begin by being. Do you desire to construct a vast and lofty fabric? Think first about the foundations of humility. The higher your structure is to be, the deeper must be its foundation. I like that. That's lofty ambitions. Milton, gratitude bestows reverence, allowing us to encounter everyday epiphanies, those transcendent moments of awe that change forever how we experience life and the world. So with that in mind, I wish you an awesome day. Moms or anyone that's had a mother, let's be appreciative of what they've done for us, and everyone have a truly great day, and thank you.